So I'm luckily joined by Ruby Warrington, who's the voice behind the Sober Curious movement and the title of the book by the same name that was released in 2019. And Ruby, looking at your profile, you built a whole raft of brands that kind of straddle the wellness, the mystical, and the very much everyday pragmatic. And it's really great to be able to talk to you and to hear your thoughts on this whole experience and how that might
Yeah.
help some of our members that are going through this challenge. Could you tell me a bit about, how Sober Curious came about, what your relationship with alcohol was before, and how that's changed as a result?
So I first got sober curious. I often say it that way, about 10 years ago, I guess. And it was very personal and very private and wasn't something I spoke about until about 5 years ago. So the first half, that whole past decade of really getting very like investigating or really kind of getting to know what was behind the way I was drinking was very private and very internal in the beginning. And at the time and I still sort of look back and think, well, I was just a normal social drinker. But but within that terminology, right, there's so many different shades of grey. And what I now, when looking back, I'm kind of like, wow, I was drinking excessively. I was abusing alcohol all the time, but what I mean is it was so normalized in my social circles. I was working as a journalist in London at the time. The UK, as we know, similar to Australia, it's a very boozy kind of culture. And this is something I've been thinking about a lot as we're in the grips of this pandemic. It's the sort of culture where any time you're not working is an excuse to be drinking. It's like you're either working or you're drinking. And that was kind of my lifestyle. I had a really high pressure job. So I definitely wasn't drinking every day. I wouldn't ever drink during the day. But weekend binge drinking, half bottle of wine with dinner if I went out with friends, that sort of thing. But it was very, very normalized. So it never looked like what I thought problem drinking looked like. So I had to really be very vigilant and diagnose for myself that my drinking was a problem. Because like I said, it didn't come with that problem drinking tag on it. I hadn't ever got in trouble from my drinking. I never blacked out, never like got lost or like wound up in some strange bed, or do you know what I mean? Like none of those classic things. And in fact, most people, my family members, partner, friends included, when I first started to really take more and more extended breaks from drinking, to the extent that I eventually let people know, I think I'm just going to quit. The response was, why? Why would you do that? It was like the opposite of an intervention, right? It wasn't like, we can see that would be helpful for you. It was like, why would you? You only have fun when you drink. Like, you're a great drunk. Like, so yeah, it was a lot of, so the Sober Curious, that title and that terminology, how I arrived at the point where I realized that I was the only person whose definition of my drinking as a problem really counted. If it was a problem for me, that was enough for me to quit. The process I used to get to that point was just really bringing a questioning mind to every single aspect of my drinking, right? Whether it was, how is this drink really going to make me feel? How is it going to make me feel tomorrow? Or what about in 2 days' time? Do I really need it? Why does everyone expect me to drink? Why is it hard for me to say no? And just looking at whatever questions came up, and then really being honest with myself when trying to answer those questions. So that questioning, curious sort of mentality is what I brought to my drinking and applied, over the past, like I said, 10 years, to the point where now I am completely abstinent, but I would describe myself as abstinent by choice in a way. I am an advocate for abstinence. I think that I've got to a point now where I'm like, why would anyone use this stuff? It's just poison. Like, why would you? Tell that to me 5-6 years ago, I wasn't trying to reach this point. I would never have believed I would have reached this point. But my relentless and, like I said, dogged sort of like honesty and integrity around answering all those questions for myself has brought me to this point where I know that alcohol has no use in my life. It brings me nothing. I have no desire for it. And that to me feels like a very sustainable sort of approach as well, right? I've really I've really, it's by step by step, I suppose, my own steps. I've got to a place where it feels like there would be no going back, because I've completely debunked all of my own myths around alcohol, if you like.
A lot of our members are, choose to be abstinent. Probably 80% of them have that, and probably have a kind of slightly different story to you, in that they have had some really traumatic experiences with drinking over perhaps a number of decades. And I'm sure you, through your work, also talk and work with people that have these experiences. And yet, I mean, and my experience and relationship with alcohol is probably very similar to yours. I'm curious about through that process, what did you become curious about? Because often for people that have that other background, it's really easy to quit, because, it's difficult. The process is difficult, but the reasons for it are really clear. And there's a stark reality between what life was like then and what life like is now. And yet the experience that you had, there's a much more subtle kind of drivers and reasons. What did you learn as you were going through that process of change?
Well, like I said, a lot of my friends and my own perception around my drinking had always been, I just drink to have more fun. I just drink to feel good. And what I really realized was that actually, no, I was using alcohol to numb my discomfort, to look away or cover up painful feelings, painful emotions, painful memories, things in my life that I didn't want to look at. And so as I started removing alcohol, all of this stuff started coming up to be looked at. And I was like, oh, wow, who knew I was actually suppressing a lot with this sort of very normal social drinking. There was a kind of a darker underbelly to it that I hadn't really been aware of. So that was really interesting, and realizing that actually there was this sort of underlying sense of anxiety and dis-ease in my life that I actually just thought was normal. I thought it was normal to feel anxious most of the time, and to feel stress, and to have disrupted sleep. And that was just my normal. And I thought that's just how we live, because it's a stressful world and that's just what we put up with, right? But because it wasn't directly linked to my drinking in a very sort of obvious way, I didn't ever put those two things together. What I've realized was that the alcohol itself, being a toxic sort of chemical that my body was having, obviously using a lot of energy to process and get out of my system, but actually suppressing all of that kind of underlying stuff was actually what was causing these underlying feelings of just general dis-ease and like dissatisfaction with my life. And so the more I began to remove the alcohol and actually address some of those underlying issues, which were, just memories, like painful childhood stuff, memories like really bad relationship I'd been in, but just kind of like shoved under the carpet and walked away from. And just, the average things that we all experience, the small T traumas, as they say, started to address some of that stuff and do some healing around it. I began to realize that, now there's this sense of ease that's replacing the anxiety. And there's this kind of like, life can actually be good, and I can manage things quite well. And I don't need this substance anymore, because actually now I'm just experiencing that substance as something that feels like a bit of a downer. And so my relationship with alcohol completely changed. That was one of the main reasons, actually. I really was like, I want to live a really, really full life. And living a full life means being really present with all of the experiences I've had, good and bad, and not even labeling them good and bad, but labeling this as just like the fullness of my life. And if I want to experience fully the good, I have to experience and address fully the bad, So that just became a real driver for me. Like, do I want to live a really full life, or do I want to keep using this substance that's kind of like papering over the cracks and sort of putting a glossy sheen over things that aren't really okay, When
was the last time the impulse to drink really came about you, or as a thought, or something that was difficult enough to go, whether you did or not?
Right. It's really interesting. That hasn't happened for a long time. I'd say like a good year and a half, 2 years. But then just last week, I mean, it's so interesting. What does it take? A global pandemic. But it was fleeting. It was so quick. But I was just walking down the street, and from out of nowhere, I mean, hadn't been thinking about it. It just came out of nowhere. It was like, a couple of beers. And it just felt like, I think that morning, because like I, as I was describing before we started recording, my work, is very home based. My work hasn't been, I'm so grateful. My work hasn't been impacted really at all by this. And if anything, I'm getting to spend more time with my husband and speaking to my mum on the phone more. It's all, and friends are feeling more connected digitally and stuff. And people are reaching out, taking care of each other. And I've generally been feeling like fine about things. But I think that morning I'd woken up feeling, I'd love a holiday. And then just realizing, that's not going to happen. I don't know when that's going to happen, if that's ever going to happen again. And maybe I'll just stuck in my apartment forever. And the oppressiveness of it kind of like, and I think that sort of a beer, it was like escape. Like that would be a few hours of just escape to somewhere else. And that was the first time that I'd felt like that in a long time. And in a way I was quite grateful that I experienced that, because sometimes it's interesting speaking about being sober curious, speaking to sober communities. I sometimes feel a bit disconnected from the struggles that people are in, because I feel so far away from that now. So it was quite helpful actually to be reminded of how intense that desire to escape, or how alluring that can be when you're still really in it, so that I can have some more compassion for where people are at, particularly at a time like this where, Jesus, like I said, I'm so fortunate that my circumstances mean I haven't really been very negatively impacted by this yet. I mean, who knows what each day will bring. But I'm just thinking about all the people who have lost their income, who are now at home with their kids 24/7, who are, have lost child support, whatever struggles people might be going through, and not the temptation, but the relief potentially that alcohol could seem to present in that situation. I just want to escape this for a few hours. I was reminded how intense that can be, and it really is. It's so alluring.
When you had that thought, what was your next action or next kind of process? Was it kind of a humorous curiosity, or what? Yeah, what?
Yeah, it was. I think I laughed at myself. I was like, oh, that's interesting. There was no, not even a millisecond of get a beer. Like there was no question that I would then act on it. It was just kind of like, wow, I wonder where that came from. How interesting,
Did you find, becoming sober, that other ways or mechanisms of escape came about? So this alcohol is a very culturally sanctioned one, but you remove that, but these fears or anxieties come up, and then was there anything else that you found you picked up, both, perhaps healthy or unhealthy?
Definitely work. I mean, I even mentioned it, right? Anytime we're not working is an excuse to be drinking. So take away the drink and you just find yourself working all the time. You're nodding. I'm guessing this might be you too. But I think this is, particularly in, America, where I live now, New York of all places, super workaholic culture. Like everyone's got a side hustle and a full-time job, and they're pitching something else. And there's so much like status and I don't know, just so much self-worth is also wrapped up in what you do for work. It's a really easy to get sucked into that. And as a kind of, a freelance entrepreneur, you mentioned I've sort of created multiple brands over the past decade as well. It's like, yeah, there's just all never not working is definitely something that I've experienced. And last year I had to do a bit of an intervention on myself with that one, because I'd really reached a place of burnout, and I was back in that sort of like, it wasn't so much anxiety, just this sense of overwhelm and burnout. It was actually in 2019 that the World Health Organization officially recognized burnout as a syndrome. So I know I'm not alone in that. And I just think that we do live in such a 24/7 culture, particularly as a creator. There's social media, so much pressure to just be constantly sort of churning out, putting out content, constantly having a message, constantly having something to say. And it just really, really got on top of me. So I had to just pull the plug on various projects and go a bit quiet for a while, and sort of almost force myself to get okay with doing nothing, which is what some of us are experiencing right now. Also, that thing about, oh God, how do I just do nothing? Like, that's weird. Yeah. So yeah, definitely work. So that kind of healthy in a way is like, a lot of the work I do is very fulfilling to me, and it also helps a lot of other people, but then unhealthy in the sense that I was really burnt out and not really there in the way that I wanted to be for my family and friends either. In terms of other unhealthy habits, I've never probably was eating a bit more sugar in the earlier days, but it's interesting. I've never had when it comes to substances and things, like a super addictive personality. I smoked a bit in my 20s when I'd have a drink, but had zero problem putting that down. Like sugar's never really been a thing for me. It's just, it's more kind of, I guess, social media potentially connected to work, but those were the things that came in. It was interesting, but then I could apply the same mindset, the same curiosity as to why do you feel like you need to have inbox zero? You know, like that, and questioning it.
When I started Hello Sunday Morning, I remember a message that I got from someone. She wrote in. She said, "Oh, I've had 3 kids and didn't drink for 9 months at a time. I didn't have to go out and tell the world about it and build a brand and do all this other stuff. Do you have the sense of creating an identity around sober curiosity and your other work? Where does that come from for you? What really drives you to do this kind of thing?"
It's really interesting. I've always been a journalist and I've always been a writer. I went to journalism school. I've always been a reporter, and I still see myself that way. For me, my career was sort of swept out from under my feet with the advent of digital media. And I'd been writing and making a living as an editor and a writer. And suddenly, commissions, the fee rates got cut in half. And so I wasn't able to make a living doing that anymore. And so books were a way for me to be a writer and to still do what I do in the world. And it just so happened, to get a book deal, you have to have a brand. You can't get a book deal if you don't have a social media following. You can't get a book deal if you're not doing events on a subject. It's kind of, so there's this whole pressure that comes along with selling a book. And I'm a writer and a reporter. I'm a writer and a reporter. And that's just what I do. And it's what I've always done. Even when I was a kid, my mum used to call me Radio Ruby because I would just give a running commentary on what was going on in the house and in the world. So I think, and I have a podcast now, which I really enjoy because, again, I've always loved interviewing people and just hearing stories and I just love spreading ideas. That's just what I've always done. And I think that's what, some of us do. Although it's funny, when I was writing Sober Curious, I was talking about, the evangelical phase when you just want to go around telling everyone how amazing it is. And I'm telling people to watch out for this in a book that I'm writing about this. The irony of that was not lost on me. But there is also, going back to the workaholic thing, there's definitely an element of, I have, and I think many of us share this, a bit of an addiction to validation. And I kind of want to be seen and I want my voice to be heard. And that's definitely something that I've looked at as well, in terms of my motives for some of the work I've done. Am I doing this because I want people to notice me and say, well done, give me a gold star? Or am I doing this because it's something I feel really called to share with the world?
I've always thought that part of what has driven me around this work, and probably a similar thing to you, is probably validation from particularly my dad, and not having it earlier, and in the last few years really going on an experience of journey of trying to understand that and make peace with that, both with me and also with my father. Have you had a similar thing, or where does your need for validation come from?
I think it's from my dad as well. Yeah. He was, pretty absent in my life. My parents separated when I was 1. He didn't come with us to the other part of England where we moved to. And so I definitely think, and I remember doing when I was old enough to know I did well in school and sort of getting attention from him. And so early on equating getting good grades and being smart with oh, dad's going to pay me attention now. So that's definitely part of my story.
And how have you, in later life, reconciled that? Do you feel that is still a part of what drives you to create all this stuff, to do all this work around that validation? Or have you, where does that sit with you now?
It's interesting. I mean, that came up for me a lot last year when I was looking at burnout and asking those questions, like, why am I so driven? Why am I so like, you know, where does all this kind of energy come from? Why do I always push myself to do more and achieve more? And I actually wrote a whole book proposal on success addiction. I was like, I'm a successaholic. You know, I wrote a whole book proposal in the midst of my burnout. And then I had to be like, wait, I can't like be pitching this book as just me in that addiction. Like, I just need to like walk away from this. So I put it down and I walked away from it. And I've basically just been working very much behind the scenes for the past 6 months and really enjoying just, you know, I'm working now helping other people write their manuscripts and book proposals and having no sort of front facing, like praiseworthy part in it. And it's been such a relief, actually. So yeah, like I said, I had a bit of an intervention on my success addiction last year. And yeah, I guess, how have I reconciled it? I guess I've done work around forgiving my dad for not really giving me the attention that I needed. My mum's a psychotherapist, which is really helpful in this situation. You know, just really being being a bit of the grown up. And I think there's an element of that sort of being old enough now and sort of having experienced enough where I'm able to, through what I learned in getting sober curious, to be able to recognize when my behaviors are being driven by the wounded, sort of tender young part of me that hasn't had resolution on these things, and being able to sort of speak to that part of me from a more grown up and sort of balanced place, you know,
to give it a hug.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's kind of like you're enough. Just being like, just you being you is enough. In fact, what's really great is when you being you is there for your friends, and you know, it's just being Ruby, basically.
It's a great message.
That's a great question. Thanks.
Have you? And I'm conscious of perhaps the timing of this, but you're now working on a new book, which is around sort of sober curious reset.
Yes,
we have to hold these two in.
I know. Well, the thing is, this is part of my overworking thing, right? So when you have a book out, your publisher will be like, what can you give away for free for people who pre-order the book? So I was like, I know, I'll do this thing called 100-day reset, and they'll get an email from me every day for 100 days with some advice and, you know, whatever. And I'm halfway through writing this 100-day reset, which is a freebie for people who buy the book. And it's like 10,000 words. And I'm just like, what have I done? But I've already promoted it everywhere. So now I have to go through with it because people are already like pre-ordering and signing up for it. And I'm like, this is like writing a whole other book.
Yeah.
So my agent, my book agent, a couple of months ago was like, you know, people, because editors have been noticed, Sober Curious has done well, does Ruby have another book? And I was like, you know what, I've got all this content, which is new and different content to Sober Curious. And it's more about like how to, in a very practical way, apply this in your sort of everyday life through 100 days of not drinking. So that's what my new book is going to be. So it's sort of, I'm happy that content is getting used, actually, because it was a lot of work.
Amazing. And lastly, tell us about this. What's your vision for the post-COVID world? What would you like to see as we all come through this on an individual or global scale?
So what I'd really like to see is just a bit of a reset on our value systems. You know, I might get tearful as I talk about this, but I think that it's about time. You know, it's so interesting, that success addiction thing. I think we all have been, you know, we've all had some success addiction issues over the past sort of couple of decades. I think consumerism has just got completely out of control. I think the whole side hustle startup culture has really sort of bred this very workaholic, successaholic mindset. I think social media really plays into that as well. And I think that along the way, we've lost sight of what's really important, which is family, which is our connections to the people that we love, which is our connection to the natural world, which is our well-being. You know, I was reading a really interesting article the other day which was looking at statistics from, you know, an intensive care unit in Italy, and only 1% of the people who have died from coronavirus, only 1% did not have serious underlying chronic health issues. 73% of people had hypertension from stress. You know, it's like 53% of people have diabetes. And this guy was sort of saying, are we blaming this virus for the deaths, or are we blaming these underlying health issues, which are a result of this successaholic consumer culture that we've all been willfully going along with? So I really hope coming out of this, there might be a bit of a reassessment of like what's actually important, what we actually want to spend our time doing, and what we need to thrive in the world. Yeah, it's a bit of an idealistic view, but I can't help but hope. It's interesting. I did a podcast for Sober Curious with my friend Aaron Rose, and he's all about cultivating optimism, how to create social change. We need to be optimistic, you know? And it was really good to talk to him about that and just think about like, what would we like to see in the world? We have to believe it's possible for us to be able to create it. We have to be able to see it. And it reminded me actually so much of my journey of getting sober curious, or anyone's journey of removing an addiction from your life, right? Addressing an addiction. You enter into that process with so much fear, feeling like you're going to lose out, feeling like it's going to leave you so lonely and disconnected, and it's going to be so difficult and challenging. But you believe, you're optimistic that on the other side, there's a better life for you. And I think that we're sort of going through that process collectively now. Like, there may be some difficult times ahead. There will be difficult times ahead as certain things that we feel like we've come to rely on are stripped away. But beyond that, I think we've got to believe that there's hope for a better world.
I share that hope with you. Ruby, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me.